Hello to everyone. Thank you for joining us again today. This is Sunday, March 19th, and I'm Pastor Steve Green, Brighton Word of Faith Church. My wife Penny and I pastor here. There are two things I want to mention today. This is going to be a much shorter version today because this weekend is not a regular church weekend. So the first thing I want to mention is remind everybody about the special meetings that we're having with Keith and Lori Trump, our visitors from Indianapolis that are with us this weekend. On Friday evening, that would be March 17th, we're having a Bible school graduation, and that's at 7 p.m. at the church. There are 3 graduates of the ITC Bible School and then 4 certificate awards are going to be presented also to those who have not yet completed the course but have completed one or more modules of the course. And so that is going to be a ceremony. It's for the whole church and for guests and for visitors. Anybody can attend. 7 p.m. We'll have coffee and dessert served afterward. And then Saturday, 4 sessions with Keith Trump on the subject of learning the easy way. And that's going to be from 10 to noon, 2 sessions, then a potluck lunch, and then 1:30 to 3:30, 2 more sessions. And then regular church on Sunday morning, March 19th. Regular church as far as the regular timing goes, but again, we'll have our special guests with us on Sunday morning. So please join us if you live in our vicinity, if we are available, readily available to you within traveling distance. We would love to see you with us at all of the above events or one of them, the Saturday events. You can come for all or part of that. So we would like to extend a warm invitation to you. So given that this is not a regular church weekend, I do not have a regular message, but I did want to acknowledge any of you who make a point of connecting with us through the YouTube message. I want to acknowledge you and to reach out to you with not a full message this week, but what the key point was of our message last week. And this is repetition then, a little bit of repetition, but it's necessary repetition. It is something that we can need to meditate on every day. So to get a reminder of what the key point was 1 week later is not too much. I can guarantee you. The main thought that is not only from the message last week, not only the main thought from the book of Galatians, but the main thought of the New Testament, the new covenant in the blood of Jesus, what Jesus shed his blood for. This is the key central thought. It forms a dividing line between the Old Testament and the New Testament. It is a dividing line also between life and death, blessing and cursing. This is the critical issue in our life. This is what everything comes down to. So it is with a lot of excitement that I just want to touch briefly on it again with you let's look at a couple of scriptures before we get to Galatians, or one scripture before we get to Galatians. I want to say that the intended result from our short time together today is that you and I, that we would see Christ crucified, that we would see that in our heart, and that we would get the significance of it, how his death impacts how we live, that we would respond to him in the manner in which he has loved us, that we would love him because he first loved us. In Deuteronomy 30 and verse 19, it says, I call heaven and earth as witnesses today against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both you and your descendants may live. And so that is Deuteronomy. That is related to the presentation of Old Testament law. This is the New Testament version of the same thing, what we're looking at today, and we find it in Galatians in chapter 2 and verse 20. I've been crucified with Christ, Paul says. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And we find out how he can say that, what he means by that he no longer lives, but Christ lives in him. He goes on to say the life which he now lives in the flesh. That's a very important thought, because He's not talking about the means by which we are born again. He is not talking about how we first come to Christ. That's not the issue with the Galatian church. The issue is for those of us who are saved, who have come to Christ, whose sins have been forgiven. The issue is, how do we now live? And that's the issue that Paul is directing his attention to. So he says, the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. And so loving, he loved us. He gave himself for us. The Greek word translated gave is paradidomai, meaning to surrender, to yield, to commit to. So Jesus yielded, surrendered, committed himself to his Father in obedience for the sake of Paul and all of us. He died for us. He loved us, and he gave himself. He surrendered, yielded, committed himself to us. And so Paul is seeing this. He's seeing this crucifixion. He's seeing this love. He's seeing this surrender of Jesus for him. And he is moved. He is compelled in his heart to respond in like fashion, to where now he is living for Christ. He's yielding, surrendering, committing himself to the cause of Christ. And because he's doing that, he can say, I have been crucified with Christ. I no longer live. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me, because he is learning to live every moment of every day in surrender to Christ and to the will of Christ, to the cause of Christ in his life. And so then this is what faith means in the book of Galatians. This is the clear picture of what faith is when we trust in Jesus, and because we trust him, we're willing to do what he says. And so now we're living not on the basis of law, we're not living on the basis of Old Testament law, but we are living on the basis of the words that Jesus said. So, the words that Jesus said. So then, faith, to define then what faith is here in Galatians, and we should mention this, is that the book of Galatians is a contrast between faith and law. And Paul literally goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Faith is this, law by contrast is that. Faith is this, law is that. Faith is this, law is that. He's making a repeated contrast between faith and law, that the reader, that you and I would get a very, very clear idea of precisely what it is that we're being asked to do. We're being asked to be people of faith and not law. And one of the things we see in the book of Galatians is that the Old Testament law, the law of Moses given on Mount Sinai, is that it's prototypical. In other words, briefly put, if the law of Moses, which includes the Ten Commandments written with the finger of God on tablets of stone, if that law is not good enough to bring divine life to us, the abundant life, the life of God, if that law is not sufficient or adequate to bring to us the life of God, then there is no law that can do it. So then now we're talking not just about the law of Moses, but we're talking about all the different things that everybody everywhere thinks about, other than those that are surrendered to Christ. We're talking about all normal, regular human beings on the earth that have various codes that they live by, ethics that they live by, standards they live by, strategies for successful living. The things that, in effect, they may not be using this word or thinking this word. They may not be religious or spiritual at all. The word righteousness may not even be in their vocabulary. But in terms of how God speaks of righteousness, this would be any and all efforts of anybody, anywhere, to be righteous in their own ability, in their own strength. So then again, it would include all philosophies, all principles of living, all ethics, all moral codes, all religions, all strategies for successful living. None of these can produce righteousness, and because they cannot produce righteousness, that means they cannot produce life. There is no spiritual life that can come from any of these things, even if they involve people trying their very, very best to be good people. That's precisely the problem. That is exactly what God does not want. He does not want us trying our very, very best to be good people, because in the history of mankind that has never worked. What we need is, instead of that, instead of flesh, is we need need the Spirit, we need grace, we need the power of God enabling us to live righteously, that different standard, that higher standard of goodness that is meaningful to God, meaningful to us, meaningful to the people around us. It is something that God can inhabit. He can inhabit righteousness. He flows in it. He reaches out, touches people, connects with people, makes an impact upon people's lives through the righteousness of His own people. This is what God wants, and He wants it to be understood clearly, plainly. He's adamant about it. It's the only thing. He says later in Galatians, the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. Love being another word for righteousness. They in effect mean the same thing. And so here in Galatians, we see not in 3 consecutive verses, but in 3 verses that follow closely upon one another, we see Jesus crucified. And then this becomes the basis for the New Testament message. This is the basis for what faith is. Faith works by grace, or the power of the Spirit. Law works by the power of the flesh. Faith empowers a process whereby you and I are being perfected in love. The weakness of law always produces moral failure. Faith produces a blessing, law produces curse. Faith produces life, the law produces death. And therefore, any effort, again, it could be in a religious realm, it could be the law of Moses, it could be the Jewish religion, it could be any other religion, it could be people that have no religion at all. Anything and everything that falls into these categories, it's all represented by the law of Moses and the weakness of that law to produce anything from a divine standpoint, anything meaningful in our lives. And so, coming back to Galatians 2:20 then again, Paul says, I've been crucified with Christ. He's speaking of himself at this point. It's his own personal testimony he's sharing at this point. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me, because he is surrendering himself to the cause of Christ. He's learning to live by the words of Jesus. We see this in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus saying, you've heard that it has been said, you shall not murder. That, of course, is law. That's one of the 10 commandments. You shall not murder. But I say, see, that's the critical, there again, that would be in Matthew, the same issue we're looking at here in Galatians. That's the dividing line. It's the dividing line between Old Testament and New. It's the dividing line between blessing and cursing, life and death. You've heard that it has been said, law. But I say to you, now here is where we have surrender to a person. So it's going to be words like these words that Jesus shares. These are the things that we learn to surrender ourselves to, and then to so weave his words into the fabric of our life that we become conscious of them. And as we go about our day, as we're doing things, just the routines of life, you know, am I doing what Jesus said? Am I conscious of him? Am I flowing with him? Am I yielding to him? Is this me? Is this just me doing this because I think it's a good idea, because I'm trying to be a good person, because I'm trying to win in life, I'm trying to get ahead, I want to have this, I want to have, is that what I'm doing? Or is it a surrender to Jesus and his cause? Is that motivating me? And it's many of the same things. It could be making sandwiches. It can be getting ready for the day, doing our hair. As you can see, I've done my hair again today. Anything and everything that we do throughout our day, we can do it from a motivation of doing it for the purpose and the cause of Christ. And so we have an opportunity to examine ourselves. And so that really would be the key point we're getting at in our time period we have today is examining ourselves. Examining ourselves. That is what communion is about. Communion is about remember. If we were to go to 1 Corinthians 11, I have one verse here, but if we were to read it a little more thoroughly, at the end of that chapter, it's talking about communion. It's talking about how communion is remembering Christ. It's remembering his death. And then in that context of remembering Christ, it's the same thing. It's talking about seeing Christ crucified. And then in response to that, he says, this is verse 28 of 1 Corinthians 11, let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. And so this idea of examining ourselves, what is my motive? We're not talking about how things look on the outside, how they may appear to other people. We're talking about the motive of our heart. Why am I doing this? And that becomes critical. That becomes critical because it's not the outward appearance that determines life and death for us. It is the motive of the heart that is compelling us to do what we do or don't do what we don't do. So here, coming back to Galatians, we've mentioned one verse, Galatians 2:20. We've read it a couple of times. I've been crucified with Christ. Let's look at two verses that follow closely after that each of which are drawing our attention to Christ crucified. Just two verses later in chapter 3 and verse 1, Paul says, O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Because they, of course, were now thinking they want to be Christians, they don't want to be Jewish. They have confessed Christ, that's what they want, but they have been taught now that you need to follow Jewish law in order to be a good Christian. You have to confess Jesus to be saved, but after you're saved, you need to now follow Old Testament law in order to properly fulfill that commitment. And in response to that, Paul says, O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you that you should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed among you as crucified? So we have Jesus in chapter 2 and verse 20 loving us and giving himself for us. So there's a picture of the cross. Here we have Jesus Christ clearly portrayed among you as crucified. And the point Paul's making is to the Galatians is that if they can see Christ crucified, then it should be obvious, clearly, plainly, blatantly obvious that of course we don't follow Old Testament law. If Christ is going to die on the cross for us, then the only possible sensible way of us living would then be to respond in like fashion and give ourselves to him, which is fundamentally different from trying to follow a law. The difference is the same as between night and day, black and white. And so that's why he said, O foolish Galatians, because Jesus Christ had been clearly portrayed among them as crucified. And finally, Galatians 3:13, and this is one many of us will recognize, Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law. So we're talking about the crucifixion. He has redeemed us from the curse of the law. The many curses, we read 54 verses of curses in Deuteronomy 28, all of the curses that come upon a person who does not fully keep 100% all the laws of Moses. Christ has redeemed us from that curse, the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. And so now we have a picture of somebody hanging on a tree. Jesus redeeming us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us. That was clearly on the cross. So again, three verses, not in perfect succession, 1, 2, 3, but in close proximity to each other. Three verses emphasizing that Jesus died on the cross for us, for our benefit, and we have a response, a necessary response, a response of faith. The particular kind of faith that we respond with is the kind that also gives, the kind that also commits and surrenders, the kind that commits oneself to a cause. That's how we respond in faith to what Jesus did for us, and that is the basis upon which we examine ourselves. So that would be my exhortation to you this week, to examine yourselves, to make it part of our daily living. Again, as we said earlier, weave this into the fabric of our daily living to where we become increasingly conscious of the reasons, not just what we're doing, but the reasons why we're doing it, what our motive is. Am I loving Jesus? Is that my motive? Because that is what makes all the difference. We love you. We hope that you can join us. Maybe by the time that you watch this, you have already joined us for some or all of the activities this weekend. We would love to have you be part of that. And if you're unable to participate in any of our in-person activities this week. We are extremely grateful to you that you have made the time to be part of this broadcast. God bless you.